Okay, so in the last episode, I discussed with you a few of the misapprehensions I believe that many people have about the nature of religion. And so starting with this episode here, I'll be doing a sort of three-part series on what I believe religion to be. That is the kind of elements that all religions share, and which I think can really help us to understand what makes religions tick, and the kind of influence that religions have on the world. So basically, I believe that if you want to understand religion, you have to look at three elements of religion, and those are religious concepts, the nature of religious groups, and the nature of religious institutions. So groups and institutions we will tackle in the next two episodes, but today we'll focus on what I believe religious concepts to be, how it is they are developed, and why I believe that is important. So we can begin, of course, with a discussion of what exactly concepts are. Now, concepts are often used in vague ways in philosophy and psychology and so on. So there's no sort of clear fixed definition about what a concept is. But basically I would suggest that concepts are kind of mental structures that we learn and that we develop throughout our lives, which permit us to do two things. That is, they permit us to recognize certain things in the world, and they permit us to recognize what those things do. So as a very simple example, if I have a concept of a dog, that concept permits me to look out into the world and say, oh, that thing with four legs and a tail is a dog, and because I know it's a dog, it tells me how I can interact with that thing. I can pet it, I can play with it, I can feed it, and so on. All of this depends on having a concept of a dog, which, as I said, permits me first to recognize that something is indeed a dog, and then to understand the kind of properties that thing has, and therefore how I can interact with it. So, to put it in the shortest possible terms, concepts permit us to A, interpret the world, and B, to forge certain possibilities in the world. And our thinking is deeply structured by the concepts we have, and we don't ordinarily notice it in the flow of everyday life, because the way that concepts are employed are in a very immediate way, so that when I look at my table, for example, and I see a glass of water, I can immediately recognize that this is a glass of water. It seems perfectly natural that I should interpret the world in this way, but actually this depends on my having a concept of a glass of water, and it is only through these concepts that I can structure the world in this way to understand that this thing really is a glass of water, and also what can be done with this glass of water. That is, I can, of course, pick it up and drink it. Now, this might all seem very trite and obvious, but I think that there are a couple of interesting consequences of recognizing the conceptual nature of thought. So the first is that the world itself has a particular nature, of course, but the way that we actually see the world and interpret the world is as much a reflection of our own interests as it is in the nature of the world in itself. So there are in principle a basically infinite number of ways that we could split up the world and interpret the world, but the fact is that there are many potential concepts, many particular ways we might have of thinking about the world that we in fact never employ. So for example, it would be perfectly coherent to have a concept of things which have an internal angle of somewhere between 36 and 39 degrees. There are a lot of things in the world which would fall under the rubric of this concept, but the fact that none of us really have this concept, we certainly never employ it in our day-to-day lives, we never think to group objects by the exact number of degrees that their internal angles might have. Rather, we divide the world up conceptually into the sorts of things that are useful or interesting to us. So it's obviously important that I have a concept of what water is, because I need water to live. It makes perfect sense that my conceptual framework would include this concept of water because water is very important to my life. On the other hand, knowing that something has an internal angle of 37.4 degrees is not particularly useful. There is no situation where my recognizing that something falls into the class of things which have an internal angle of 37.4 degrees is ever going to be useful. And in principle, we should expect our concepts to really reflect the nature of the world, because if the concepts do not reflect the nature of the world, then that can lead us into some pretty difficult situations. So if I do not correctly conceptualize of water as a colorless, odorless liquid which can be drunk, or if I mistake mud for water, for example, this is going to have a very negative influence on my life. So concepts should, in a way, be tethered to reality, but the point is they don't always have to be. In fact, sometimes concepts can still be useful, even if they do not really mirror reality at all. So, like one classic example from the literature is the concepts that we have about trees. So every culture in the world, that I'm familiar with at least, has a concept corresponding to what we call a tree. But as any good botanist will be able to tell you, trees, in a sense, don't actually exist, or at least the kind of things that we call trees, that we try to fit under the concept of a tree, are often very distantly related things. So conifers and oak trees, for example, don't really share any common recent biological history. Through evolution, of course, they have developed very similar morphologies, that they superficially look similar. But if we attempt to define in a rigorous biological way what a tree is, we actually find that there is nothing coherent in the world that corresponds to this concept. But, of course, every culture has developed this concept of a tree. We all use this concept of trees in our everyday life, and that is because the things that we call trees are similar enough for human purposes to be referred to with the same word. So, if it is raining and we need to find shelter, it's possible to say something like, let's find a tree to shelter under. And each of us will know more or less what that word is referring to, and the point here is that even though it doesn't necessarily correspond to anything deeply real, it is still profoundly useful to have this concept. It is useful to know that there are some things in the world that we can take shelter under. It's useful to know that there are some things in the world that we can cut down in order to get wood. So human beings have developed this concept of a tree, not because there are actual things in the world, like trees, that we need to give a name to, but rather because there are things in the world which are similar enough for human purposes that it is useful and valuable to think about them under a unified conceptual scheme. But there can also be cases where concepts are plainly inapt or plainly inaccurately reflecting the nature of reality. So if we go back to our concept of a dog, if we have someone who is scared of dogs, part of their concept of dog, part of what that word means for them, is going to include this idea that dogs are inherently big, scary creatures who are to be avoided at all costs. And the nature of this concept is not purely an intellectual judgment, or it's not like they see a dog and then later sort of calculate that it might be scary or anything like this. Rather, their very experience of the dog at the moment is shaped by the particular concept that they have in their minds. So it means that they are not going to experience the dog as it really is. I mean, no one can really experience a dog as it really is, because everyone's experience of the dog is going to be shaped by their concept of a dog. But if you have this particular concept of a dog, which implies that dogs are big, mean, and scary, then you are going to experience the things that the dog does in a very immediate sense in this way. So it means if the dog starts yelping, for example, a person who is afraid of dogs is going to interpret that as a sign of aggression. If the dog tries to jump on them in order to play, they're going to interpret this as a kind of attack. They will probably tend to interpret dogs as much bigger or much more powerful than they actually are in reality. So here we should be clear that having a concept of a dog is not a purely intellectual process. This is not a process of just recognizing things that are actually there in the world and giving them a name. Rather, it is a way of structuring experience in a way that would, at least theoretically, be to the advantage of the human being. So certainly, if someone has had negative experiences with dogs in the past, then it makes sense that their concepts are going to reflect their personal experience, and it's going to include this notion that dogs are big, scary, aggressive animals. But the point is that the concepts that we have do not actually have to reflect reality in order to have a very meaningful influence on how we see the world, maybe sometimes for better, maybe sometimes for worse, but concepts reflect our interests as human beings, our own particular interests as human beings. They are not reflections of reality per se. So you might be able to see where I'm going with all this, and that is to say that religious concepts, of course, function in exactly the same way as ordinary concepts. That is, they are a way of interpreting the world, of forging particular possibilities in the world. They intimately structure our experience of the world and our understanding of what is happening in the world. But religious concepts, just like ordinary concepts, do not have to reflect reality as it actually is, again, whatever that might mean, but rather they are there to serve human interests, whether or not they are fictional, whether or not they accurately map reality. Religious concepts are basically just ways of structuring our experience of the world in a way that reflects our human interests. So just as a person who is scared of dogs will have a concept of dogs which prejudices them to interpret dogs as big, scary, powerful creatures, a believer in God, let's say, might experience a sunset in a very immediate way as a sign of God's power, as a sign of God's goodness, His majesty, and so on. The concept they have of God is ultimately just a way they have of structuring their experience so that the world can be interpreted and, directly experienced in a way that reflects their human interests, in a way that reflects the value they place on things like goodness and beauty and so on. And this is why I think it's important to study the nature of religious concepts, because religious concepts, like ordinary concepts, are not just these abstract intellectual propositions that can be drawn upon to explain the world as though they were kind of an encyclopedic reference or something like that, but rather the religious concepts that people have are structuring in a very deep and intimate way the way that they experience the world. They don't see a sunset and then think about it for a while and come to the judgment that this must be God's handiwork. Rather, they see God in the very sunset itself. The sunset itself is experienced in a particular way that is structured by the concept that they have of God. And I think that this is important to appreciate because there is a tendency, and I especially notice this with a lot of atheist thinkers, to treat religious beliefs as, these sort of sterile, propositional kinds of knowledge that believers draw on as though they were a kind of encyclopedia, and that if only we could show them that these ideas were mistaken, that they would abandon their beliefs, and that somehow religious beliefs are a failure of reason or something like that. But we have to understand that when a person has a particular religious concept, they are not simply drawing on this concept after the fact in order to explain something they have experienced, but rather it is shaping the very nature of the experience itself. And so in this way, every concept is sort of self-reinforcing. So with every yelp that the dog gives, the notion that dogs are big and scary animals is going to be reinforced. The concept is shaping one's experience of the world in a way which actually lends credence to the concept in the first place. And in the case of religious concepts, again, you're going to have this sort of loop of reinforcement that is going to be very difficult in practice to break. It's going to be very difficult to convince someone that there is not an all-good God when every time they look out at the world, their experience is being shaped by this very concept, this concept of a good God, which reinforces the notion that there is a good God. They look at a sunset, their concept of God prejudices them to interpret it as a sign of God's goodness, so thereby the concept of God's goodness is going to be reinforced. And you see this most clearly, ironically, I think, when people actually abandon certain religious commitments, when they decide for purely intellectual reasons that religious claims are not true and that they will become an atheist instead. But what they very often find is that it is much easier to abandon particular intellectual commitments that can be expressed in terms of propositions, but it's much more difficult to abandon the conceptual prejudices which have been amassed throughout a lifetime of religious adherence. So the classic example here would be the lapsed Catholic, where they recognize, for one reason or another, that they no longer believe that God exists, but at the same time, the certain ways that they have been conditioned into thinking about the world are much more difficult to shake. So think, for example, that they have been taught for their entire life that sex, particularly premarital sex, is something sinful. It's not something that should be enjoyed, certainly. It's there purely for procreation, and even then only within the confines of the sacrament of marriage. So even if they reject the idea that sin really exists, even if they reject the pronouncements of the church on sexuality, they can still be left with this feeling that is very difficult to shake, that sex is something inherently dirty, that it's something disgusting, it's something to be avoided, perhaps. And this is because the concepts that they have regarding sex are structuring their experience of sex in a very deep and intimate way. It's not as though you can suddenly decide sex is not sinful and then everything will be okay, because you still have these cognitive structures which are biasing you to interpret the world in particular ways. Even if you consciously disavow this, even if you recognize that it is silly to consider sex to be something disgusting, it's still very difficult to decouple your experience of that act with the conceptual prejudices you have amassed throughout your entire life. So I'd almost go so far as to say that if you want to understand what it is that is motivating religious people, what it is that is motivating the particular actions they perform in the world, you shouldn't go looking at their expressed beliefs, that is, the kind of propositions that they endorse about religiosity. You certainly shouldn't go poring through official religious doctrines. For reasons that we'll talk about in a future episode, there is often a very major gulf between what it is a religion officially endorses and what it is that people in that faith actually believe and do. But if you want to understand what is motivating religious people, you should not look at these things. Rather, you should look at the kind of concepts that they are using, because these are much more intimately influencing the way that they interpret the world and the kind of possibilities they see for themselves in the world, because this is what concepts do. And so these are just some of the ways that we can see that religious concepts are just concepts. They work in the same way. They are being created by the same cognitive structures that all human beings share. So there isn't a clear division between things that are, let's say, ordinary concepts and things which are clearly religious concepts. But nonetheless, I think that there are certain features that are much more commonly found in religious concepts than in ordinary concepts, and these are the things that we are going to discuss for the rest of the episode. So again, I believe that this is important because if we can understand the nature of religious concepts, we are in a much better place to understand religion as a phenomenon in the world, and especially understanding a lot of the negative consequences of religiosity. In case it wasn't already clear, this is an atheistic podcast, so we're not going to be treating religion very kindly here. I am going to be stressing that religion has a number of deeply problematic aspects, and the nature of religious concepts is just one of those aspects. There are certain things about the very nature of religious concepts which makes them problematic, and that's part of what we are going to discuss here. But I'll argue here that religious concepts share three very similar foundations that are much more typically found in religious concepts as opposed to ordinary concepts, and that there are then three additional ways that these conceptual foundations can be elaborated in order to arrive at the complex concepts that you find at the heart of all religious traditions. So at the foundation of all religious beliefs, you find, I argue, these three features. They are reification, essentialisation, and a high degree of affective-evaluative salience. Now, if your eyes are beginning to glaze over, I entirely sympathize. That is some scary sounding language, but the concepts underlying them, I think, are relatively simple, and I'll attempt to explain as best I can what they mean. But these three processes of reification, essentialisation, and the high affective-evaluative salience of religious concepts lie for me at the very base of all religious thought. If you ever encounter religious thinking, if you ever encounter someone who is thinking about the world in an identifiably religious way, their thinking is going to involve these three processes. So we'll begin with this idea of reification. So reification basically just means to take something that is abstract or intangible and to attempt to construe it as something physically present or something with real causal efficacy in the world. So the word reification just comes from the Latin word res, which means thing. So reification really just means to thingify something. You are transforming an abstract process or event or property into a concrete thing and thinking about it as though it exists as a kind of ordinary thing in the world. So when I say that this process of reification is central to the production of religious concepts, what I basically mean is that a lot of religious concepts, if not most of them, if not all of them perhaps, are constructed by taking something that is relatively abstract or intangible in nature and treating it as a concrete thing in the world which has causal powers which can literally influence events in the world. So, as an example of this, think about the concept of luck. So, ordinarily people have a concept of luck as a kind of abstract thing that we can use to describe certain situations that we think were unlikely to have happened. But ordinarily people treat luck as this sort of dependent property of particular events. It's not something that's really circulating in the world or that you can marshal or attract or anything like this. But the point is that there are people who do think about luck in exactly these terms. There are people who think that by engaging in certain processes or by clasping onto certain talismans, for example, that they can control the amount of luck that they are receiving in their lives. And this depends on a reified conception of luck, almost as though luck was a kind of commodity that you can find in the world, that you can channel to your advantage, and that luck is an independently circulating force of sorts that can influence what happens in your life. And when someone has a belief in luck of this sort, they are very prone to behaviors that we would classify as superstitious. They believe that there are certain rituals they can enact or certain things that they can do in the world, which is going to control the amount of luck that they receive in their lives. So luck, again, is not just this abstract property, but it is something very real in the world. You can have different quantities of luck. You can affect the way that luck flows through the world. You can affect how much luck is coming towards you. And all of these depend on a reified conception of luck as something that exists really as a force in the world. Not merely in a metaphorical sense, but in the very literal sense that there is something out there called luck. And you can probably immediately see here that if we have this sort of conception of luck as a kind of circulating force that we can control with particular rituals, we already seem to have a fairly proto-religious concept on our hands. There are indeed many particularly indigenous religious traditions. In my book, I reference the Dusun people in Malaysia, who believe that luck is very literally a resource. It is something that can be traded. It is something that you can exhaust. So if you have too much luck in one situation, that can actually be a bad thing because you are depleting the amount of luck you have available to you in the future. And so just by taking something abstract like this and treating it as a real cosmic force, you immediately have the seeds of a religious concept. And we see reified religious concepts throughout all of the major traditions in the world. So think, for example, of the Christian concept of love. So ordinarily, love is a fairly abstract concept. It does have a sort of experiential aspect to it. So, we can feel love, we can know that we are in love, and so on. But ordinarily, we should recognize that love is a kind of contingent process that emerges when two people are engaged in a caring relationship with one another. But in the Christian imagination, love is more than this. It is literally a cosmic force. It is something that is produced by God, or God himself is said to be love. And this ultimately amounts to a reified conception of love, where something that is ordinarily a dependent, abstract process that relates to particular human relationships is treated as something that exists independently of that context. So take, for example, St. Paul's words in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. He writes, "Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends." So this conception of love plainly depends on the idea that love is an independent force which can survive particular human relationships. So if two people are in love, that love is treated not simply as a contingent process that emerges from the interactions of these two people, but rather it's a cosmic force that will endure to the end of time, independently of that relationship, and it will continue long after these people have died. And this reification of emotional states is a very common trope in a lot of religious traditions. More commonly, though, we find that it is the negative emotions or negative states which are reified. Literally, they are demonized in a lot of religious traditions. So if someone endures something horrible, some horrible experience, some horrible emotion, a lot of religious traditions treat these particular emotional states not as some process internal to our organism, but rather as some kind of force that has been imposed on us from without. And very typically, these forces are imagined as demons. So in the Zoroastrian tradition, for example, there's this idea that the evil god of the universe, who is called Angra Mainyu, created a series of demons which correspond to particular moral evils that we can find in the world. So in this tradition, there are 7 moral evils that are identified. These are termed appetite, deprivation, distress, pain, sickness, lust, and torpor. So we can recognize all of these as negative states that we can experience, which are otherwise sort of abstract, or we can ordinarily recognize that they are sort of contingent states of being that our organism experiences because we are in an unpleasant situation, and this is our body's way of telling us that we ought to do something about it. But in the religious imagination, in this case in Zoroastrianism, these forces are reified as demons, that if we experience these negative states, it's because the demons with these particular names have come to impose their will on our bodies. They are external forces that are imposed from us from without, as opposed to internal states, which is, of course, how we would ordinarily conceive of emotions. As Bruce Lincoln explains this, Bruce Lincoln is a scholar of religion. He writes, and I quote, "Once free in the world, demons break into the bodies of living beings, which they corrupt, corruption being understood as a process of both moral and physical decay. Once inside, they distort a person's sentiments, behaviors, and being in ways with their individual nature." End quote. So here what he's saying is that, for example, if the lust demon encounters you, it will make you lustful. The greed demon, if it enters into your body, will make you greedy, and so on. And so these demons are the proximate causes for the emotional states you feel, or better yet, the emotional states you feel are the demons themselves who have entered your body. He continues, quote, "This can then spawn new demons, including some that infect previously unafflicted creatures, and others that wait to torment their progenitors in hell. Once unleashed, demons multiply and spread, contaminating ever more people in whom they reproduce, morph, and spread once more." End quote. So what's clearly happening here is that the Zoroastrians have identified certain aspects of human experience, so certain emotions, certain feelings, and so on, that were deemed unpleasant, and they have then reified these phenomena such that they are treated not just as passing states that human beings might have to endure from time to time, but rather they are cosmic forces that are sweeping around the world, are unseen, they can latch on to people, and they have very literal physical effects. They have, as we've said, some degree of causal efficacy. So here, for example, if the greed demon latches onto you, then you're going to become greedy. That's the causal relationship between the force of the greed demon and the kind of emotion you experience. So greed in the Zoroastrian imagination is not just a proclivity or a kind of sentiment, but it's something that is literally out there and that can deeply and intimately affect your life. Another striking example of this comes from Catherine Nixon's book entitled The Darkening Age, where she describes the experiences of a monk who was living sometime in the medieval period, and he is battling what he calls the noonday demon. And this is a demon that would attack him every day, sometime between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. So as she explains, quote, "At this time, the monk was supposed to be working, but this particular demon would thwart him and make it seem that the sun barely moves, if at all, and that the day is 50 hours long. Then he," namely the demon, "constrains the monk to look constantly out the windows, to walk outside the cell, to gaze carefully at the sun, to determine how far it stands from the 9th hour, the hour of dinner. The demon might then force the monk to poke his head out of his cell to see if any other brethren are about. Then, in the warmth of the noonday sun, the monk finds that he rubs his eyes, stretches his hands, and he takes his eyes off his book and stares at the wall. Then he returns to the book and reads a little, but as he unfolds it, he becomes preoccupied with the condition of the texts. he criticizes the orthography and the decoration. Finally, he folds the book up, places it under his head, and he falls into a light sleep." End quote. Now, I think we can all recognize in this the feeling of listlessness that often overcomes us in the middle of the day. So, that time around lunchtime, sometimes we just feel like all we want to do is lie down, have a siesta, and it can be very difficult to concentrate on basic tasks. But what the monk has done here, and this is part of his religious imagination, his religious way of conceiving of the world, is to imagine that there is this independently existing demon that is, floating around in the air, and he occasionally deigns to come into the monk's cell and afflict him with these feelings of tiredness, listlessness, and so on. So here the monk is treating his experience not just as a sort of contingent process, something that all embodied beings are liable to feel, but rather he is taking his experience as something that has been imposed on him from without. It has been caused by an independently circulating force that has, for some reason, chosen to latch onto him at these times of the day. And this to me points us in the direction of one of the dangers of reified concepts. So reified concepts are, as I've said, extremely common in religious thought, and the fact that religious thought is predicated on reified concepts can make them particularly dangerous in particular situations. And the reason for this is that there are many things that we experience in the world that are in fact not the product of independent cosmic forces. Many of the phenomena that we experience as human beings are fragile and ephemeral and contingent processes that depend on certain worldly circumstances to be realized or to be sustained. And losing sight of this can lead, I think, to some pretty maladaptive consequences. So I mentioned before the Dusun people in Malaysia who had this idea that luck is a kind of cosmic commodity that can be traded, that can be found, that really exists out there in the world. Well, the consequences of this belief for the Dusun people was, for example, that if you poisoned someone that you believed to be particularly lucky, what that meant is that there would be more luck available to you and to everyone else to draw on, because, this lucky person was simply sucking all of the luck out of the world, and so there wasn't enough for everybody else to go around. The best solution might be to poison them and hope that you could take some of the luck that they have left behind. Now, this is, an extreme example, but it does illustrate that if you take these dependent processes, these abstract properties, as independently circulating cosmic forces, you can have some pretty maladaptive ideas about how it is that these particular phenomena can best be realized. So if we can properly recognize that love is actually the result of certain circumstantial factors, then what we can start to do is, if we want people to be more lucky, all we have to do is to change the situation in some way. So someone might appear to be congenitally unlucky, for example, but amazingly, if we offer these people some support, some opportunities, some help, then we find that their lives actually appear to be more lucky. They have more positive experiences in their lives, they are happier people, more successful people, and it's not because we have successfully been able to channel this cosmic force of luck to our advantage. Rather, it's because we've recognized that luck, such that it is nothing but a dependent property of particular circumstances, and so if we want more luck in someone's life, all we need to do is to change their circumstances. So recognizing that luck is not a cosmic force, that it's a dependent property of circumstances, can be a very good motivation for this social engagement in which we attempt to change the world for the better. But if you have this belief that luck is a cosmic force that we can magically just apportion to people somehow, I think that can lead, at the very least, to a degree of complacency where we just sit back and say, wow, he's lucky, wow, she's unlucky, that's just how it is. That's just what the cosmos has decided to apportion to these people. Then I think it induces us into a state of passivity where we just accept the way that things are, or perform meaningless rituals to try to redistribute the amount of luck in the world, which are obviously not going to have any influence on how lucky someone's life is. Rather, if we want someone to be more lucky in their life, there are definitive things that we can do to make their situation better, and thereby, miraculously, making them encounter more lucky situations. And I think this sort of complacency is also evident in the Christian conception of love. So the fact is that love is not a cosmic force that is imposed on us from without, but rather it's a complex, sometimes very difficult process of negotiation with other human beings. We can't count on love as a cosmic force to endure for all time. Rather, if we want love to be realized in this world, then we have to work hard at it. We actually have to produce this love for ourselves. It's not going to be rained down upon us from heaven. We have to act lovingly. We have to bring love into existence. It's not something we can take for granted. It's not something we can expect to exist for all eternity and that will persist independently of human striving. It is rather something very fragile, something that is only the product of human action. So if you have a reified conception of love as something that is independent of human striving, you're going to have a very complacent conception, I think, of what love involves. Referring to the feelings and emotions, these are not the product, of course, of demonic intervention. They are not out there in the world waiting to latch onto us when we are at our weak moments. Rather, our emotions and feelings are bodily signals about our relationship to the world, to our environment. So if we feel hungry, that's a sign, of course, that we haven't eaten. If we feel tired, that might be a sign that we haven't slept well. These are contingent feelings, contingent emotions that depend on the particular circumstances that we exist in, and they are produced and they can be ameliorated through definite worldly actions. They're not cosmic forces that afflict us from without. We don't magically become greedy or become tired or anything like this. Rather, our greed, our hunger, and so on are products of our situations as human beings. And all of this, I think, will become a running theme throughout a lot of the future episodes in this podcast, and that's the idea that religious concepts are not simply problematic because they are untrue or unverifiable or anything like that, but rather I'm going to argue that they are problematic because they lead to inapt conceptions of the world. If you have these reified conceptions of luck or love or negative emotions or things like that, this can blind us to the particular worldly possibilities that are actually available to us to improve our situation, because religious traditions tend to insist that the things that happen in the world are the product of supernatural forces, of these independently circulating things that have been reified, as we've said. And while religions insist that these forces can be controlled or marshaled to some degree, they are otherwise something that exists entirely independently of human action and human striving. And to me, in a lot of situations, that is, to put it mildly, not a helpful way of thinking about the world. If you want to bring more love into the world, if you want less greed in the world, you can't simply wait until heaven decides to apportion more love, or you can't enact particular rituals to stave off the demon of greed. Rather, there are particular, very concrete worldly actions that we have to enact if we want to see more love, if we want to see less greed, and so on. So the point of all this is to say that although many religious concepts are of course very complex in nature, and we'll discuss some of the reasons for that complexity in a moment, at base they are very often derived from the reification of otherwise pretty ordinary, intangible or abstract concepts. And I'm sure you can think of some more examples for yourself, but I also want to be clear that this is not just an abstract academic exercise. As we have said, concepts intimately structure the way that we experience the world, and so if religious people have these reified concepts where they misattribute the nature of particular phenomena in the world and imagine them as these self-subsisting forces that human beings can at best sort of marshal or channel, but they are not responsible for creating, this can lead, I think, to some fairly dire consequences, but again, I'm sure we'll get into all these messy details in a future episode. Okay, so reification is one feature of religious concepts. A second fundamental feature of religious concepts is their tendency towards what I call essentialisation. And basically this means that a lot of religious concepts tend to depend on the idea that particular phenomena, so everything from trees to the sun to people to supernatural beings, whatever the case might be, that all of these things are the way that they are owing to their possession of some kind of metaphysical essence, which itself determines the manifest properties of these phenomena. And that's a bit of a mouthful, so I'll try to give you an illustration of what I mean, and I'll do this by invoking the cartoon character Pepe Le Pew. So now those of you who are like me and are old enough to be familiar with these Warner Brothers cartoons, you'll know that Pepe Le Pew is this amorous French skunk who falls in love with a cat, and he has all these adventures which revolve around him trying to win over the heart of this cat, and he's always unsuccessful, of course. But what has happened is that there's a black cat who has somehow received a stripe of white paint along her back, and this makes her superficially resemble a skunk. So the comedy here comes from the fact that the audience can recognize that the cat with a stripe on its back is not really a skunk, but Pepe Le Pew doesn't understand that. He sees the black cat with a white stripe and assumes on the basis of these superficial properties that the cat must be a skunk. Now, the error which the audience can of course intuitively recognize here is that just because you change the outward properties of something, it doesn't actually change the kind of thing that it is. So just because you paint a black cat to look like a skunk, it doesn't actually make it a skunk. To be a skunk, an animal has to have certain deep-seated properties that don't change when its superficial properties, or what Aristotle would have called its accidents, change. So no matter which of the cat's properties we change, there is this deep-seated belief, I think, that we all intuitively share, that it's not easy and perhaps it's even impossible to ever change a cat into a skunk. Once a cat, always a cat. And this, whether we would ever think to express it in such terms or not, is an essentialist belief about the nature of cats and about the nature of skunks. So we assume that cats have a particular essence, and that this essence determines the kind of animal that they are, and also that skunks have a kind of essence, albeit a different one, which is what ultimately makes them skunks. Now, importantly, this appears to be an intuition with a deep sort of cognitive basis. Human beings appear to be naturally predisposed to essentialist thought of this kind, particularly with respect to natural kinds like the nature of animals, trees, rocks, even people, in fact. In her studies on young children, for example, the psychologist Susan Carey has found that children are innately biased towards certain kinds of essentialist thought. So they will, for example, spontaneously attribute certain worldly facts that they experience and otherwise can't explain to the existence of hidden essences, and they believe that these essences determine how it is that phenomena are likely to behave and the kind of properties they are destined to have. So there's one famous study, for example, which actually mirrors the example that I just gave with Pepe Le Pew, that when children are asked to imagine a raccoon that is progressively surgically altered to look like a skunk, they will refuse the idea that this sort of a Frankenstein's monster of a creature could ever really become a skunk. If it's born as a raccoon, then their assumption is it has to stay that way. You can change all of the accidental properties you like, but if it is essentially a raccoon, then it will forever be a raccoon. A little bit more troublingly, studies have also found that children tend to be essentialists when it comes to human beings, and this can lead them to very inapt understandings of the way that human beings are. So children, for example, if they learn that a child is French and that the child has been raised by English-speaking parents, they will still come away with the belief that the child is destined to grow up to be a French speaker. And this is because they believe that things like language and other components of our cognition and who we are not the product of culture or contingent circumstances, but are rather the product of deep-seated essences that people just happen to possess. So if someone has the essence of a French person, they are destined to grow up to speak French. This is the essence of who they are, and it determines who they will be. And although, of course, the children would never express their beliefs in these terms, but these beliefs seem to depend on a more deep-seated sort of belief in the existence of metaphysical essences. And so when we talk about essences, there are things that we might call categorical essences. So categorical essentialism would be this idea that in order for something to be categorized as something, it has to have particular properties. So, for example, in order for a person to be classified as a bachelor, by definition, or categorically, that person has to be unmarried. In order for something to be categorized as a ball, let's say, that thing has to be somehow round or capable of being rolled or something like that. Now, importantly, categorical essentialism needn't make any metaphysical assumptions or ontological assumptions about how things actually are. So when we say that a bachelor has to be unmarried, we're not saying that the bachelor contains some essence deep inside him, which makes him incapable of ever being married. It just means that this is what the definition of a bachelor actually is. He is not a bachelor because there is something deep inside him that is compelling him to be a bachelor. Rather, this is simply how we define bachelors. But when we talk about metaphysical essences, it involves this idea that there really is some kind of causal power at work. So Actually, you can think of metaphysical essentialism as a kind of species of reification, because it also presumes the existence of some fundamental thing which can shape worldly phenomena and which has a definite causal power to affect the way that things are. So, to return to Susan Carey, who I mentioned earlier as someone who has studied the way that people think in essentialist terms, she says that a commitment to metaphysical essentialism, which again, we observe in children, in all cultures in the world, involves the tacit commitment to three basic ideas, and these are, I quote, 1. That there are causally deep properties that explain a given entity's existence, kind, and superficial properties. 2. These causally deep properties are thus more important in interpreting what kind an entity falls under than superficial observable properties. And 3. This is so even if we do not know what those causally deep properties are. End quote. And that last point is important. I think that we don't actually have to have a coherent definition of what an essence is, or even a full understanding of what this essence might be, to be committed to the existence of essences. So even if we can't properly define what an essence involves or what an essence does, there can still be this belief that if something is the way that it is that way because it possesses a kind of essence which essentially causally compels it to be that way as opposed to any other way. So to contrast that to categorical essentialization, so we understand what is required of a man in order to be classified as a bachelor. That is, he has to be unmarried. But when it comes to metaphysical essentialization, we can assume that something has an essence, even if we are not precisely able to define what that essence involves or what manifest properties something must have in order to possess that essence. So, for example, I doubt that there are very many people listening who could reliably distinguish a raven from a crow. We know that these are two different species. They must have certain different manifest properties, but at the same time, we don't have to be able to explicitly delineate what these properties are in order to recognize that crows and ravens are different species, that they are fundamentally different. And so, if you are committed to metaphysical essentialization, and again, I believe that this is a sort of innate proclivity that human beings have to assume tacitly the existence of these metaphysical essences, you can believe that something has a particular essence even if you are unable to define exactly what that essence must involve in practice or the kind of manifest properties that it must generate. So I know that this is all a little bit abstract, and you might be wondering why I'm going through all this. I will get to the point, I promise, but just before we get there, I want to be clear on the difference between categorical essentialization and metaphysical essentialization, because that's going to be important for understanding how it is that religious concepts are formed. So the big difference is that in categorical essentialization, we assume that something is what it is because of its properties, whereas in the case of metaphysical essentialization, we assume sort of the opposite, that something has the properties that it does because of what it is. So we might define a mammal, for example, as an animal that lactates. Now, I know that mammals are not simply that, but we'll simplify things and say we can define a mammal as an animal that is intrinsically capable of lactation. We would say in the philosophical jargon that lactation is a sine qua non of what it is to be a mammal. Animals which lactate are mammals, animals which don't lactate are not mammals. This is a form of categorical essentialism. But on the assumption of metaphysical essentialism, this, let's say, direction of causality is reversed. So on the assumption of metaphysical essentialism, we don't say that something is a mammal because it lactates, rather we say it lactates because it is a mammal. So something's essence is not determined by its properties, rather its properties are determined by its essence. And this is where we finally get to the point, and that is that religious concepts are predicated on metaphysical essentialization typically. So there is this presumption that there are these deep-seated causal powers which cause things to have the properties that they have. So when we examine religious concepts, we often find that they depend on this intuitive bias towards metaphysical essences. And one good example of this can be found in Chinese religion and Chinese philosophy, where there is a belief in certain kind of universal essences that can be found in a wide variety of phenomena. And there is this belief that these essences determine the manifest properties of the phenomena in question. So the most famous example of this would be the yin-yang distinction in Chinese thought. And the idea here is that certain phenomena just happen to possess a certain essence of yin or a certain essence of yang, and that these essences determine what the phenomena are like. So certain things are the way that they are because they possess yin or they possess yang in different quantities. So men, for example, are thought to be more masculine because they possess the essence of yang in greater abundance than they do the essence of yin. Whereas, of course, women are more feminine because they possess the essence of yin in greater abundance than yang. So again here, it's important to note the direction of causality. So the thought is not that we should classify men on the yang side of the spectrum because they are more masculine. Rather, we are saying they are more masculine because they possess yang. It is yang here which is exerting a kind of causal force over what it is that men are. Another example of metaphysical thought in Chinese religion and Chinese philosophy is the so-called Wu Jing conceptual scheme, which suggests that there are 5 fundamental essences. These correspond to water, fire, metal, earth, and wood. So again, these are essences which can be shared by many different kinds of phenomena, and even people can be affected by these essences. And so once more, there's this understanding that it is these deep universal essences which determine the nature of things rather than the other way around. So if we want to understand the nature of water under this Wu Jing conceptual scheme, we're going to note that water possesses the essence of yin, and it is yin which compels the water to be cool, to flow downwards, and things like this. And also that it possesses the essence of shui in the Wu Jing system, which supposedly explains why it is able to put out fires, why it is fundamentally amorphous, and other properties like this. So the fact that water possesses shui explains why it is that water has the properties that it does. The essence is here literally causing something to happen. And this bias towards metaphysical essentialism in religion is useful for religions because it posits the existence of these timeless, fundamental, unchanging entities. Yin and yang have always been there. They've always been the same. They've always had the same effect on the world. And these sorts of concepts that are timeless and unchanging are obviously useful to any religious tradition which wants to persist over time and to appeal to the timeless nature of its truth. In order to do this, a religion needs to posit certain timeless truths which can ensure that the tradition will always remain culturally relevant, no matter where you live, no matter what age you're living in. Yin and yang will always be there, doing the same things they have always done. And this is politically useful in a religious context because it permits religions to posit, for example, certain social arrangements or particular social roles as stemming not from some arbitrary social arrangement which could be overturned or questioned, but rather as stemming from some fundamental essences that cannot be challenged and certainly can never be changed. So, patriarchy, for example, has often been defended in a religious context by appeals to the essential differences between men and women. Men are imagined as being essentially stronger, so the thinking goes. Men are essentially more rational. Men were created by God with the particular properties they need to administer his will on earth, so it therefore stands to reason that men deserve access to political power and women don't. This is a consequence of deep essential properties that men have. Again, this is according to the religious logic that women simply don't have. Similarly, if you want to justify other kinds of social inequality, for example, the caste system in Hinduism, you can again appeal to fundamental essential differences between classes of people. So in India, the Brahmin class have traditionally controlled political power. They've certainly traditionally controlled religious institutions, religious rituals, and so on. Whereas the Shudra class have been expected to basically slog it out all day in the fields under the employ of the Brahmins, and this system is justified by appeals to the essential superiority of the Brahmin caste. They simply are essentially superior to the Shudra caste, and that is why, according to the Brahminical rhetoric, that this system cannot be challenged. If you are born a Brahmin, you will always be a Brahmin. You have certain properties which elevate you above others, whereas if you are born a Shudra, you should always stay a Shudra. You should always stay at the bottom of the social pecking order because essentially that is who you are. You can never change this. You can never contest it. It is essentially, again, who you are. We'll talk about the nature of religious mythology in a future episode, but for now I'll simply note that a lot of religious myths make appeals to this kind of metaphysical essentialism. A lot of religious myths are designed to show that the prevailing social order is a product not of contingent historical processes, but is rather something that has been designed, that has been imputed into the world by cosmic forces, and therefore that these social systems cannot be challenged. So a lot of cosmogonies in the religious imagination, or a lot of etiological tales which discuss the origin of particular phenomena in the world, are basically essentialist justifications for how the world is. The world is the way it is because it was designed to be this way, because certain cosmic forces necessitate that it is this way. And this kind of thinking, again, I think depends on metaphysical essentialism. The idea that certain things are the way they are, they can never be changed, they can certainly never be challenged. If you can successfully appeal to the existence of metaphysical essences, then this is going to make your job as a ruling power, as an authority, much easier. We are on top because we are essentially superior. You are on the bottom because you are essentially inferior. This is just how the world is. This is how the world was created by certain cosmic forces, so don't bother questioning it. And I think it's this tendency towards metaphysical essentialism in religion that can also be implicated in the tendency of religious traditions towards very, let's say, conservative beliefs or practices. So a lot of opposition in religious circles to transgenderism, for example, I think rests on this essentialist assumption that men are men, women are women. Gender is not something that is performed, it is not something that is intersubjectively negotiated. It's simply that someone is born with a penis, therefore they have the essence of a man. Someone is born with a vagina, therefore they have the essence of a woman. And so any move towards questioning or undermining these essential differences between men and women is going to be treated inevitably with a lot of hostility. Not simply because these trends are seen as morally objectionable, though, of course, concepts of gender in religion tend to be highly morally charged, but also because the undermining of gender roles violates a very deep and I think very intuitive set of expectations about what gender and sex are. For better or for worse, one of the first fundamental differences that children can apparently recognize in the world are differences in gender. Even infants are intrinsically geared towards distinguishing between men and women. So any move to blur these distinctions is, of course, going to be met with hostility because it does violate, I think, deep-seated metaphysical assumptions about the different essences of men and women. The insistence that marriage should be between a man and a woman for the purposes of procreation is also undergirded by these essentialist assumptions about the nature of marriage, about the nature of the relationship between men and women, and so on. And so what all of this shows is that while one of the virtues often credited to religion is the idea that religion can propagate a core of stable truths across different generations, across different cultures, and so on, there is this dark side to this aspect as well because of this tendency towards essentialism in religious thought. Religious thinking is very often going to be inflexible, characterized by a tendency towards political conservatism, a support for the status quo, and therefore, as we'll probably see in future episodes, a degree of friendliness towards political authoritarianism and a kind of intersection of religious and political power. All of this depends on the assumption that there exist certain timeless, immutable, unchanging truths which govern the nature of the world, that these truths cannot be questioned. And all of this depends, I think, on belief in metaphysical essences which govern the development of a great many religious concepts. Okay, so that's reification and essentialization down. The third fundamental basis for the development of religious concepts is what I call the tendency of religious concepts towards a high degree of affective-evaluative salience. Now, that is a bit of a mouthful, so let me attempt to unpack what that means. When I say that they have a high affective-evaluative salience, the affective part of that term simply refers to emotions. So affect is emotion. So if a religious concept has a high affective salience, it just means that this concept is wedded in one way or another to a strong emotional response. That is part of what the concept means. So if you are a Christian, for example, with a concept of God, then that concept is very intimately wedded to emotions like joy and love and so on. These emotional responses are an integral part of one's understanding of God. On the flip side, if you have a concept like sin, that is going to be wedded to very strong moral emotions such as disgust, guilt, and shame, and so on. And so when I say that religious concepts tend to have a strong affective salience, it just means that we cannot treat these concepts as banal concepts that are being drawn on in a sort of passive or dispassionate way in order to interpret the world, but rather they are wedded to very strong, very deep, very integral human emotions, and that is obviously going to have a big influence on the worldly impact of religious concepts. You can't just understand the belief in God as a sort of abstract commitment to a set of propositions, but it's rather a commitment that involves a very strong emotional component as well. And so that's why you'll never hear a Christian saying something like, well, I believe God exists, but, I don't really care if he does or not, or, yeah, I believe that Jesus is the Son of God, but it's not so important whether he really was or wasn't. Rather because these concepts have been vested with such a high degree of emotional salience, it means that the emotions are an integral part of the concept itself. You can't believe in God, really, at least within a Christian context, and believe that that belief is a matter of indifference. I mean, yeah, sure, you could be a pantheist maybe, or a deist who doesn't consider this God to be of particular importance, but that is not possible within the Christian tradition because the concept itself implies this degree of emotional commitment. Someone who says, I don't care whether or not Jesus Christ is the Son of God, but I believe he probably is, they are going to have a hard time fitting in with other Christians. In a very real sense, even if they both assent to this idea that Jesus was the Son of God, if you don't have an appropriate emotional response to that, if you don't recognize the importance and the significance of Jesus' sonship, then you simply have an inapt concept of what Jesus is. The emotions here are a key part of what it means to believe in God and to believe in the sonship of Jesus Christ. Now, there are of course some religious concepts which don't appear to be strongly wedded to particular emotions in this sense. So if we consider how Taoists think about the nature of the Tao, I think it would be a bit of a stretch to imagine that the Tao is filling them with joy or love or happiness or anything like this. So not all religious concepts have to have a strong affective component necessarily, even though many of them do, but they do at least have to have a strong evaluative component. So even though Taoists do not love the Tao, they still consider the Tao to be something singularly important. I mean, the Tao is at the basis of reality. It is the fundamental reason for anything that happens. It is something that creates all of the important phenomena that we experience in the world. And so it's simply inevitable that the Tao is going to be treated as something very, very important, as an indispensable concept for understanding how the world works. So this is what I mean when I say that religious concepts tend to have a high evaluative component as well. It just means that these concepts are treated, again, not just as idle, sterile concepts, as ordinary concepts are, but that they denote something singularly important and significant about the world. If you want to understand how the world works, you need to have a proper appreciation for these concepts. And this is one reason that religions have been termed global meaning systems, and that's because they are systems of thought that include concepts that represent, the most generally important things that there are imagined to exist. So God, the Tao, concepts like this are seen as very important because they can explain much of the world. So if we want to live happy, fulfilled lives, so the logic runs, we need to give due consideration to these concepts. We need to give due consideration to God or Tao or so on. Otherwise, our lives are liable to be empty and meaningless. So when I say that religious concepts tend to have a high affective-evaluative salience, it basically just means that A, they inspire strong emotions, and or B, they are taken to be extremely important in explaining and understanding the nature of the world. Another way to say this is that there are no incidental concepts in religion. You never have these concepts that a religious tradition develops and says, you can take it or leave it, this is our best try, but we think the situation might be like this is our best guess. No, rather, if you have a concept that is central to a religious tradition, you know that it is going to inspire high emotions in people, or you know that that concept is going to be treated as something very important, as something that can never be compromised or ignored, or in a great many cases, such as the concept of God, it has both components together. God is something that can inspire high emotions, and it is also treated as a concept that is of singular importance for understanding our human condition. So I don't think we need to dwell on this aspect of religious concepts too much. I think it's probably the least controversial of everything I'm going to say here. Basically, every field of religious studies that I'm familiar with will recognize the emotional importance, at least, of religious concepts, or how important emotions and senses of meaning and purpose are to the religious tradition. So cognitive anthropologists like Clifford Geertz have described religions as basically a set of symbols that manipulate moods. There have been social psychologists who talk about religions representing a kind of emotional regime, that they exist in order to manage the emotions of large groups. And even scholars that I find myself disagreeing with on almost every other issue, scholars like Eliade and Otto and James, who really do have, I think, a very naive and obsequious conception of what religious practice involves. They will also point to the centrality of emotions to the religious experience. So when I say that all religious concepts have a high affective-evaluative salience, that is my own language. It sounds a little bit pompous to put it that way, but at the same time, I think that basically every scholar I'm familiar with would agree with this characterization. Now, we can of course ask why it should be that religions should be filled with these sorts of concepts. In the first place, it's almost tautological to say that religious concepts are characterized by their high affective-evaluative salience, because that is just part of what religions are. They are global meaning systems, they are emotional regimes. That is part of what it means for something to be a religion vis-a-vis some other club, some other organization. So by definition, that organization is going to have these concepts with a high affective-evaluative salience in order to be classified as a religion in the first place. But as to how it is, cognitively, let's say that these sorts of concepts are developed within a religious tradition, it can basically be done in one of two ways. So one way to get a concept with a high affective evaluative salience is to simply take a concept that already has this sort of salience and to reify it, to treat it as a quasi-supernatural thing with effective causal powers, as we discussed in the first part of this episode. So love is obviously an emotion that is extremely important to people, so all Christianity needs to do is to take that concept, to reify it, so to say that love is not just a contingent process, but actually it's the manifestation of the God who is central to our tradition. He is the one who distributes and apportions love in the universe, and immediately you have a concept that is central to Christianity that has a high affective evaluative salience. God is love immediately imputes a meaning, an importance, a high affective salience to what God is. Christianity doesn't need to go to any more effort to justify the importance of God. It simply needs to identify God with love. And we find a very similar process in the development of the Islamic concept of Allah, which is where concepts that are part of the ordinary world and are taken as extremely important and significant and valuable and so on are simply attributed to God as one of the titles of God, implying that God is the originator or the foundation of these particularly valuable things. So one of Allah's 99 titles, for example, is Ar-Rahim, which means all-merciful. Or he's referred to as As-Salam, which means all-peaceful. So here we are taking concepts like mercy, like peace, which are already imputed with a high degree of importance and emotional salience for human beings, and then it's simply reifying them as aspects of Allah's nature. And so that way it can sort of piggyback on the importance that these concepts will already have for human beings and simply impute them to the concept that is at the center of their religious tradition, that is Allah. So a religious concept can have a high affective evaluative salience simply because it involves the reification of a concept that already has a high affective evaluative salience. But the second path to this sort of concept in a religious context is through a process of what we might call sacralization. So a religious tradition can take a concept that ordinarily might not appear so important, but it can impute this particular concept with a degree of significance through these, let's say, sacred making rituals. A ritual that can impute some object or some concept with a degree of specialness, which grants it a high affective evaluative salience within some particular religious context. So basically every religious tradition can have its peculiar concepts, things which might seem a little bit strange to outsiders, where outsiders could not imagine why this particular concept would be seen as representing something of particular significance to believers. So, for example, a lot of non-Christians might be baffled by the amount of time and effort that has been spent exploring the nature of the Trinity. Non-Christians are going to have a hard time explaining the kind of violence that these debates have inspired throughout history. A lot of non-Hindus might be a little bit confused by the esteem in which cows are held in the Hindu tradition, just as a lot of non-Jews and non-Muslims might be a little bit confused by the taboo of eating the flesh of pigs in these religious traditions. And look, honestly, I think that some degree of bewilderment is justified in these cases. I mean, there's nothing inherently important about whether the Father and the Son share the same substance or merely a similar substance. There's nothing particularly special or unique about animals like cows or pigs that render them worthy of special moral attention. But as we'll see in the next couple of episodes, religious practice itself is characterized by a high degree of emotional involvement. Emotions are extremely important for the development of groups. That will be the topic of the next episode, and for holding these groups together. And it's also very important for encouraging religious adherence, including participation in particular rituals, the observation and adherence to particular religious institutions. These also require a very strong management of the emotions of religious adherence. So there are good reasons why religious traditions would wish to elevate even seemingly trivial concepts to a place of centrality and vesting them with an extreme degree of importance. And in this way, they do become markers of identity. So a Jew or a Muslim demarcates themselves from other people by virtue of their refusal to eat pork. Hindus separate themselves from others by refusing to eat beef. Christians separate themselves from heretical Christians by having the quote-unquote orthodox conception of the Trinity. So there are in fact good pragmatic reasons for religious traditions to sacralize otherwise trivial concepts in this way, and that is why every religious tradition does this. That is why every religious tradition has some commitments that to outsiders seem a little bit odd. So religious traditions, as I said, will encourage the development of these concepts, and it can do this through a process of what we might call sacred-making rituals. Anne Taves, who is a scholar of religion, refers to this as the sense of specialness that is engendered by religious ritual. So the goal of these religious rituals is to render certain things special, or set apart, or sacred. So when a priest consecrates the host, in one sense it's just a wafer. It's just words that are being communicated to a wafer. It's just a cup of wine. Nothing appears to be changed by these words, and there is nothing intrinsically special about either of these objects. But the whole point of the ritual of the consecration is to generate a particular emotional response in the congregation, and to ensure that this emotional response is linked not merely to the wafer or to the wine, but to the significance of the tradition in general. It serves to bring Jesus closer to the adherents. It draws the believers together into a common practice. So the idea that a wafer and a cup of wine can change into the body and the blood of Jesus Christ is, of course, a little bit silly if we look at it from a purely abstract intellectual point of view. But when we look at the function that this ceremony serves in Catholicism and why it is vested with such importance, then it starts to make a bit more sense. It does serve a number of valuable functions that serve to make the Catholic tradition, I think, more vivid, more important, more central to the lives of those seated in the congregation. So there are most definitely incentives for religious traditions to infuse even otherwise trivial concepts with a high degree of affective evaluative salience, but this, of course, does come with a dark side as well. And that is that when banal concepts can be elevated into matters of existential urgency by this process of sacralization, then we can expect to see a lack of flexibility or of proportionality in terms of how these particular concepts are invoked. So people throughout history have been attacked and killed because they have been seen as having the wrong attitude towards the Trinity, or the wrong attitude towards cows, or the wrong attitude towards pigs. So when concepts like these are elevated to a place of centrality and vested with such a huge degree of effective evaluative salience, it becomes much more difficult, I think, for believers to level appropriate moral judgments, because everything has already been infused with a huge amount of significance by the tradition. They have been posited as sacred duties that you must follow if you are to be following God's will. So you end up with crazy situations, and like this is a very extreme example, but I think it illustrates the point well. There was a fire at a girls' school in Saudi Arabia, so the girls ran out of the school in various states of undress. This took place at night, I think, so they were in pajamas and things like this, I presume. But the morality police, of course, arrived on the scene, saw all of these girls in a partial state of undress, and so they forced them to return to the burning building to get their clothes on. Many of them perished, and that is a lesson that if you place so much significance on religious accoutrements like the hijab or the modesty of women, it prevents you from leveling proportional moral judgments like perhaps the lives of these girls is a little bit more important than their sexual modesty. But if sexual modesty has been elevated to a central place in the faith, if Muslims have been conditioned to view sexual modesty with such a feverish degree of emotional and evaluative significance, then the actions of these morality police make a perverse kind of sense. They've simply been habituated, or I would say manipulated into this belief that sexual immodesty in women is something that should inspire disgust. It should inspire moral disgust. It should inspire condemnation. It should inspire anger. And as we've said with respect to concepts, when you have a particular concept, that is shaping the way that you experience the world at the moment. It's not a kind of after-the-fact intellectual judgment that you impose on a situation. Rather, it is something that is shaping in a very intimate way your experience of the situation before you. So the morality police in Saudi Arabia didn't look at the situation, scratch their heads and think, well, I believe I read a Quranic passage somewhere that said that sexual modesty is very important. No, rather they have been conditioned to view sexual immodesty, as we've said, as something that is associated with very strong negative emotions. And so when they saw these girls in a state of undress, these very strong negative emotions of disgust and anger and so on arose basically inevitably, because they are so intertwined with the notion of immodest dress in women, and these emotions must have simply clouded their ability to render a sensible moral judgment. If their moral appraisal of the situation was unduly governed by the sense of disgust that they felt at seeing the hair or the shoulders of these girls, then it's simply going to be more difficult for them to recognize the other morally salient emotions in this situation, such as the fear of the girls, the need to protect them from the fire. So, as I've said, this is an extreme example, of course, but This exists in every religious tradition where you have things which, to be honest, do not really matter, are not particularly important, but they have been raised to such a high degree of significance within the faith that believers are unwilling to compromise them. They are willing to instigate violence and other means of social oppression in order to see these particular concepts and the practices associated with them realized. So we're going to see some of the pernicious effects about the emotional significance of a lot of religious concepts in the next 2 episodes. As I've said, emotions are extremely important to the development of religious groups and religious institutions. But yeah, I mean, we're often told that religions are valuable because they provide meaning to people's lives, that they can generate these strong, powerful emotions like love and joy and so on. But wherever a religion lends its backing to what I think are genuinely laudable emotions or evaluations, what we typically find is that the religion is just piggybacking on ordinary human judgments anyway. So when Christianity tells me that love is valuable, well, I think we would have been able to work that out even without the past 2,000 years of Christian theology. Love is something that is already valuable. It's simply been reified and given a particular conceptual framework within Christianity. Or, as we've just noted, the dark side to this of religion generating meaning and strong emotions is that it doesn't just generate emotions like love and joy, it also generates emotions like anger, fear, shame, disgust, and so on. And it often imputes a great deal of meaning to things that should not matter. So it's not simply that they are giving people some sort of meaning in their lives, some sort of purpose to aspire to, but a lot of the time, I think, it is giving people extremely inappropriate meanings in their life. It is teaching people to pursue extremely trivial things that are not going to contribute to their well-being or anyone else's well-being. And particularly when you consider that a lot of these strong emotions and the sense of meaning comes from reified and essentialized concepts. So these are concepts with what I can only say is a dubious nature. They are treated as kind of invisible causal powers that, of course, cannot really be detected by science. So people are placing an awful lot of value and importance in supernatural concepts, would be another way to say it. And again, I think there's a little bit of danger to that, because if you are vesting this much value, this much importance in supernatural things, isn't that in some way going to blind you to the importance of things that occur in the natural world, the way that reality actually is? Are you going to become so focused on heavenly love that you blind yourself to the nature of worldly love? Are you going to be so fixated on the prospect of divine justice that you forget to enact justice in this world? These are, I think, dangers which stem from placing so much value, so much importance, so much emotional labor into religious concepts. Okay, so as I said at the start of the episode, these 3 features of religious concepts, reification, essentialization, and the high effective evaluative salience of religious concepts, these are just at the foundations of religious concepts. So all religious concepts, I think, include these processes or these features, but they are not sufficient in themselves to explain some of the more complex religious concepts that we come across. So, of course, I think God is not simply a reification of love. God is a much more complex concept than that. And so in order to explain how these more complex concepts are developed within religion, we need 3 more features, which I refer to as conceptual perfectionism, conceptual blending, and cross-domain conceptualization. I am not going to get into these now. I think I'm going to save them for a future episode, and I'll try to show how complex concepts like God can be generated from these sorts of conceptual foundations, so from the processes of reification, essentialisation, and the high affective evaluative salience of the concepts. But you also need these additional processes in order to generate complex religious concepts like God, as I've said. So we will talk about that in a future episode. Otherwise, this episode is going to become like 4 hours long, and I don't think any of you want that. I certainly don't want that. So we will cover these sorts of concepts in the future. So that brings us to the end of this episode then. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for listening. See you again next time, and bye-bye.